Hey guys, it's Gav here, and this month we're going to jump right in with some hands-on work. I was going to do a video this month going on camera, but I've kind of got this conjunctivitis, this eye kind of virus that's been going around, so my eyes are kind of red. I'm feeling pretty good now, and it's passing, but I'm like, they don't want to see that. So let's jump in, and I want to talk about practical fine-tuning in terms of retouching and cloning and stuff like that, and share some hands-on tips for how we can improve that. We do a lot of videos in the field, we do a lot of videos editing, but we're going to dig into some advanced techniques, I guess I would say, although not terribly complicated. So we're going to look at moving stuff around on an image. We're going to look at some of the restoration images that I've worked on and things like that, and take those and talk about how you can do more advanced cloning stuff. So the first thing we're going to do is jump in here. Some of this is stuff we talk about in my Retouching Magic workshop, but I wanted to do something special for you guys that really kind of summarizes some of these techniques that you can use in Photoshop or a similar pixel editor, and that also uses some of the modern tools that are used in doing this. Of course, the first thing we're going to do, I've already got some images open in Photoshop. Now, some of these other ones are projects that I've done because there's hours into them, and so I'm going to kind of show you things that I did with these other ones, but we're not going to do them start to finish because it would take too long. I'm going to start with this one, though, and this is just an open image, and first thing I'm going to do is double-click the background and the layers and make it a layer instead of a locked background. And I'm going to go ahead and start looking at this. Now, here's an image when we were down paragliding last fall down in Utah, and it's a nice image, but for illustrative purposes, I might want to do more. Okay, I might want to paint some clouds up in here, and let's just make a layer. And I was actually playing with this earlier and looking at it, what I could do with it. So I might want to go up here and say, hey, let's add some clouds into this to give a little bit more oomph to it, right? So I would go through, and this isn't so much about adding the clouds, but I want to give you an idea of kind of the concepts that I might be thinking when I was doing this. So I would take a cloud brush, and I might go through here and just start adding some stuff, right? And this is a little sloppy, but let's say I wanted to do this. All right, so I'm maybe doing an illustration, and I want to kind of draw the glider into the center point, and so I'm going to do that on another layer, of course, as is good retouching practice, as you see me doing all the actions. Lightroom and raw editors, those are kind of this single layer deep complete edit, right? But when we get into Photoshop, we're getting into the refined stuff. Oftentimes it's intimidating for people, and so they'll just use Lightroom or some kind of a camera raw or on one or something like that, right? They'll just use a raw editor. Raw editors are great for workflow and production, the basic edits and bringing out dynamic range. That's why we do things like the natural HDR presets in Lightroom. But that's also why I do things like Loomis and Alchemist and retouching in Photoshop. And so leaving one or the other out, you're actually really missing out. There's also old schoolers that only use Photoshop, and so they miss out on that dynamic range efficiency and the workflow efficiency. So the best of both worlds. Don't be afraid of either one, and also don't be afraid to go in and start digging into some more advanced illustration stuff like we're going to see today. You know, like pixel painting, like getting brushes to paint some clouds in, you know? Sometimes you want a completely natural image, and that's fine. But sometimes you're doing work that requires some specifics. Now, here's what I want to do with this glider today. I just want to take him, and I want to move him down a little bit so I can crop in a little tighter. I just want to move him a little closer to the horizon. The image is good. It's composed pretty well. But let's say I'm making this for an illustration that needs to fit a specific format, okay? So let me just turn off those clouds that we did. There's a couple ways I could do this. First of all, I could just select, and I could go here, and I could use the Content Aware Move tool, okay? So I'm going to go to here, and I'm going to use the Content Aware Move, and I'm just going to bring him down and over a bit to the right hand of the composition, and I'm going to hit Enter, and you're going to see that it's going to try to fill in that space and move him. Now, we have an open sky here, so theoretically, this is a fairly easy way to do this. And you can see it did move him, but let's look. It kind of left some issues, right? Wasn't a perfect blend. Okay, so that's one way to do this. Obviously, when you're doing a retouching, you want to start with the simplest way. The problem you have now is you have all this area that doesn't quite match. So now we could go in here and we could do some cloning, let's say. We might go to this layer and we do some cloning, and we kind of feather these together. You can see I have a large cloning, and then I'm going to hit the Command-Alt or Command-Option, and I can go up and down to adjust the hardness, or left and right to adjust the size, right? So I'm going to do a fairly soft image, and you can see that I could actually soften it because I have all this open sky, and probably make this work pretty well. The problem is, I still have a little bit of color issue, because I'm moving down and it's a little darker color up here and lighter color down here. And the idea with Content Aware is that it's supposed to fix that, but the truth is it doesn't always work. So let's look at a different approach that's a little more manual. Try the automated stuff first, but if it doesn't work, don't be afraid to get in and use some old school techniques. I'm just going to take a selection of this, and I'm going to layer via copy. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Now you can see down here my layers. I've made a copy. Nothing's changed, right? I've just isolated this element, okay? So what? Here's what I can do. Now that I've made a copy of it, I can erase him from the scene. So instead of trying to move him, I'm actually going to select all this, which is nicely in the blue. I'm going to go to Fill on my base layer. I'm actually going to make a copy of my base layer, because I always like to keep my base layer intact in case I need to fade out or do a layer mask down to it or restore something. It's a good practice. I'm going to go to Fill here. I'm right-clicking. I'm going to go to Fill, and I'm going to use the Content Aware Fill, which is in the newer versions of Photoshop. So the idea here is that it's going to fill all this in with blue. Now, of course, this gets more complicated if you're in somewhere that has got other stuff, right? If I was doing a Content Aware Fill down in the trees, it might take doing smaller bits at a time. Let's take one thing at a time, though. I've removed the glider, but you can see there's some artifacting in here. So this is fairly common, especially with large content-aware stuff, but it's a lot easier to fix than the last one. So I can actually go up here and just kind of use a really nice soft cloning brush and just kind of feather that in. So I'm going to go here, and you see what I'm doing. I'm kind of saying, okay, here's my color, right? I am Option or Alt clicking to select a target point and then kind of painting down. Another thing you can do with something like this is I could use a partial opacity clone, which is going to work good for an area like this where I'm just trying to get a continuous color. And so I'm going to kind of move around, and the trick with good cloning is you can get these really natural looks. Play with opacity, play with softness, play with brush size. Don't keep your target point always the same, right? Because you'll kind of end up with these repetitions. I could go up here and I could say, hey, let's duplicate some of these clouds. But if I went all along and just duplicated over and over and over again, it would start looking repetitive. I don't want that. So you want there to be an element of randomness. And so you can change brush sizes and things like that to kind of maintain an element of randomness like I'm doing here with these clouds, okay? I can also manually paint in some clouds like we talked about. Now we have a clean sky. We've basically erased the glider from the sky, and I can now put him back in. But here's the ticket. I can now move him as well. So I'm going to select this layer, and I'm just going to move him down. But here's the thing. We have that same problem, right? I'm going to move him down, and I'm actually going to make him a little larger here. Okay, let's do that. That's good. Now we're getting a nice tight composition, but we see that there's kind of this fade off in the blending. Now there's a couple ways to do it. You could use blend if. So let's go to blending options on this. I'm going to zoom up a little. All right. You can see we have this hard edge. I didn't feather it or anything. Now we could use blend if, and blend if would allow us to either fade out a color on this layer or the underlying layer. So if I grab the highlights and started fading out, you see it starts fading out the highlights on the luminance channel. All right. And I could also do that in reverse from the underlying layer. But I can also select the color channels. So in this case, I'm going to select blue, or I could select green, or I could select red. Now, I can fade out this way, and you can see how this kind of disappears, right? And this is a good way to quickly clear this out. If I was doing something quick, this would be fine. Then I could go back here, I could actually duplicate this layer, because you can see I've actually removed some of this, some of the details here. So how could I fix that? Well, I could actually make a copy of my glider layer, and I could make no layer style on the one, right? And I could have a layer style on the other. What that would do is it would allow me, just do it real quick here. See, I'm fading out. Whoops, that's green layer. Fading out, so I blend nicely. Then what I could do is I could come back up here. And I can click and adjust this at any time, by the way. It is non-destructive. So I do it as little as possible. Then I could come back up. And what I could do is just mask this back in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to Alt or Option click and add a layer mask. And by holding the Alt, instead of a general layer mask, I'm adding a hide layer mask. So now this layer I made is completely hidden. But if I paint white on that area, and let me go back up and select a regular round circular brush. Okay. White. There we go. And reset my brushes with the B key. And set my background color to white. So that I'm now painting white. Remember, white reveals the mask and black conceals the mask. Okay? So make my background white and paint it in. What you can see here is I can bring the detail back into that wing while leaving the original layer that I've masked out. Now there is one problem here though. The strings. If I really want the strings to look good, it's a little off because you can see in my blend if I'm killing my strings just a little bit in order to get rid of that blue edge. I can do it right about there. And you know what? That looks pretty dang good. So I'm going to group these, select both of them, click, Command click, or Control. I'm going to group those so I have glider, right? Again, now I have my sky and my glider in it. Now, these strings aren't too bad. Everything looks pretty good, but you can see that it's cutting out. It's kind of pixelating the strings just a little bit. Very fine. So unless I was printing this, right, probably not going to be an issue. But I always like doing things right. Let's look at one other way that I could do it, okay? So I'm going to take this. I'm going to leave the version that I did, make a copy of this layer that did not have the blend if, delete the layer mask, and hide the glider layer, okay? So we still have our other work, but I have this jaggy layer here now. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take that layer, Command or Control click on it, so it's making a selection around that layer. Now, I'm going to use that selection as a starting point, and I'm going to feather by 50 pixels. Then I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to make a layer mask on that layer. Okay? So now I've masked out in a way that's softening the edges just a little bit. Not very much. So, what do I need to do? Well, black conceals. So if I paint black on this layer mask for this layer, what am I going to do? I'm going to conceal that edge. Okay, so here's how I'm going to handle it. I'm going to make a really soft brush and just start feathering in like this. Now I'm doing this brush at about 60% opacity, so I can kind of gradually feather in. What I'm doing is I'm not removing the blue from the whole image in this case. I'm going around where there's a hard line between where the edges meet, and I'm feathering it gradually so as to make it imperceptible to the eye. Now you can see down here, I need to do a little more work, and I would actually come back. Remember, if I go too far and cut into him, I can come back and hit X, which switches the swatches, and paint that back in, because we're doing a non-destructive edit on a mask. So this is a way where you're kind of combining your masks. Let's work it here. Your masks with your cloning and your content-aware fill and all that kind of stuff. Still a little bit off, though, here, right? Now, I could move it around, try and find a place where it blends. See, as I get down low, the color of the sky is changing. So I could find my sweet spot here, too. Look at that. Now it's blending in pretty good, and there we go. So, let's look. We started here, and we moved here. Pretty simple, right? Now let's turn our clouds layer back on. Now this clouds layer is a little cheesy because I did it kind of quickly. I would spend a little more time on it. I'm also going to dial the opacity back, etc. I want to make it look a little more natural than this. I don't want things to feel artificial if I'm doing heavy retouching. But this could be done in something. Maybe you're making a stock image or you're doing a portrait and it needs work. Whatever it is. And so you can apply these techniques to where you're combining cloning and content-aware fill, and then you combine that in a layer. You make a layer copy. You make a selection, let's say, with the lasso, and then you're going to right-click and make a layer via copy, which leaves your sublayer alone, and it makes a new copy of whatever you've selected. Now, a lot of these things are Photoshop basics that you already know. If you're not experienced in Photoshop, some of these things may be things that you want to go take more intensive Photoshop courses or videos on YouTube or something like that specifically deal with how to use layer masks, how to make selections, how to separate layers. But I want to combine those basic techniques that you may know or that you may go out and learn more about with these concepts of trying to get smooth gradients and have things look good. Okay, let's look at the difference. This one is cut in this way, and you can see that my strings are really natural looking. This is how they came out of camera. This one is cut in using the blend if, which was quicker and easier. And in this case, by dialing in that blend if, it looks pretty dang good. The strings are not bad at all. So frankly, in this case, I think we could have gone with the easier method. And I can, of course, go back to that layer, and that's the beauty of this, is it didn't require any specific selection or masking. I went to the blend if, which is basically saying blend if it meets these parameters. It's either the luminance channel in gray or it's red, green, or blue, and it's within the luminance value of 0 to 255, etc. You can also hold Option and split this and give yourself a little more finesse in terms of how it does the blend. But you can see, you don't want to go too far. I don't want to go all the way because then I'll take too much out, right? It gradually starts fading more and more of the values out as you do it. So I just want to go until it blends in, and that's how I retain the strings in the glider. So there's one way. We looked at using the clone to kind of fill in some of the artifacts that you might get from a content-aware fill. We also could have done a clone and erase the glider in the same way as we did to start with no content-aware fill at all, just by taking that clone and matching an area in the sky, brushing it in, moving where our start point is, brushing it in. The thing with a clone that you want to remember is as you clone, let me snapshot this and just flatten it for now, just temporarily so I can show you guys. Let's say I was in this place with just a cloning brush, right? Clone stamp tool, which is kind of the old school way. And I wanted to clone this guy out, okay? So I'm going to turn my clone up, and I'm cloning out. But remember, see that little square there? That square represents where I defined my start point by Option or Alt clicking, okay? It's not like the quick healing brush or something like that where it just measures the area around. I'm actually defining where I want it to take it from. And so you can see it's easy to go over and end up with a mess. So you'll have to continually move, change your brush size, and just kind of gradually work with where you're cloning from. Basically, you're having to find a sample to follow. The fault in the finding a sample to follow is that you will oftentimes end up with some kind of repetitiveness that you're not going to want, especially when you get in an area that gets tight, right? In this area, I'm trying to get it blued out, right? And so I have to try and find these matching areas that work where I can kind of paint up and down and have a continuous color that's sensible. Now, there's a rough job. Usually, if I'm cloning like this, I'll do a somewhat of a rough job. Then what I'll do is I'll come back and I'll smooth it out. I might come back and adjust my clone to partial opacity and do things that make it randomized a little bit, that bring those details back out. I'm going to go back to my snapshot where we were, because in this case, the way we did it worked well. Usually I'll try something like a content-aware fill, like a patch tool, something like that, and use it as a starting point to getting the image the way I need it. Real quick look at some other more advanced restorations and things like that. Here's one I did for two of them, actually. This is a photo of Command Sergeant Major, and I went through and did some refinement on. This one was fairly simple in that I updated his medals and things like that from a service photo. I put the proper patches and badges. But there was still quite a bit of work involved, because if you look at my layers, you'll see that I had to take an image, for example, of this, right? And I had to put it in where it belonged, and then I had to take that layer, and I had to use modifications in terms of transforming perspective and distorting it and stuff, so it fit the perspective. And we probably don't have time to go into all that from start to finish today, but the bottom line is I had to isolate the object that I wanted to have put on, right? So I put it in there. Then I started using layer masks. So you can see I had to have the tassel go over it, right? So I actually had to have a layer mask, and I did that for sure rather than erasing, because I can adjust it. So I got the piece in place that I was updating. Then I came in and I used a layer mask to mask away that piece where it needed to be so that the tassels and things showed over the top of it. Then I actually went in and I had to cut it in around the collar as if it went under, right? Because if I were to disable the layer mask, you can see that it's just a photo sitting here, right? That's what the layer mask does. So I essentially erased it in those spots, but in a non-destructive way. So here it was less of a cloning issue and more of a positioning issue. I'll oftentimes change the opacity of a layer, and what I would do is change the opacity and then go to transform and edit the perspective, the warping, whatever you need to do to get it positionally so it fits, right? Then I went to that layer mask and fit it in there. We had to do the same down here with this one here, and you can see behind here I actually cloned out the old one. Now if I turn that metal off, it looks a little sloppy, but when I turn it back on, you can see that I've actually done some burning and dodging. To make these kind of things look natural, you need to sometimes burn and dodge the underlying layer a little bit. You can see how I've burnt edges and stuff a little bit to make the dimension look natural, and this one came out pretty good. This was a similar one. This was actually his father who died in World War II, and we did an extensive restoration because all we had to start with, was this. Okay, we had this old photo that had been made, and it was kind of an illustrated photo somebody done a long time ago, because this man's dad died in the war, and so they took this photo and they had a uniform. I think they might have taken like a photo of him from before he went to the war and then put like a uniform, but it didn't have any of the medals or anything like that. And so the customer came in and they said, well, I want, here's all these medals that I've collected over the years that went with my dad and that he has the right to, and I want them put on. And so you can see that we brought those in a similar way, right? I had to come in here, and in this case, I really had nothing to start with. So the customer would give me input in terms of, okay, where do the metals go, right? And you can see that there's a ton of layers here. Each one I went through, okay? And I would add each metal and each piece as an individual piece. And so I had all these parts and patches and things that were added. And you can see underneath I did a lot of painting and shadowing on the base layer to make them look natural, like they fit. There was also a struggle with this photo. Was very vintage looking. So I actually, if you look down here in my patches, you can see that I faded the color from what the photos, because I actually took photos of the metals that the son had in person, right? The appropriate ornamentations. And so I was consulted on that side of positioning and where they go and all that kind of stuff. My job was to get those to look appropriate. And so to match the actually somewhat painted and not perfectly photorealistic look of the original, I would actually diminish some detail, and I've actually added some effects to these to diminish some of the detail on the parts so they didn't look too photorealistic. If I zoom in, you can see that I've actually used some of the painting effects in Photoshop to bring out some smart filters and stuff to make it less detailed in this case, right? There's the photo, there's less detailed, and then you can see that I actually went back and I used painting and burning and dodging to put shadowing underneath to get a result that looked good, and the family was really happy with this. And so, no, it's not a photorealistic painting from scratch, because that would have taken an inordinate amount of time. What we did is we brought in the ornamentations, we put them where they belonged, we gave a color theming that looked like it fit, it looked like it was intentional, and produced a really nice a really nice print for the client that they really treasure, because of course this is his father that he's never even met because he passed in World War II. So that was a really neat project that really kind of brought out my skills. And what you realize the more you work with this stuff, it's not just about cloning skills or painting in skills. As you advance in Photoshop and want to do more, a lot of times when I do a landscape, I want it to be natural. I want it to be clean. But sometimes you need to do projects where you're doing illustrative work or where you're doing restorations. And as you learn and increase in these, it's going to give you more power. It's going to give you more abilities. And being good at this stuff, it actually helps you to be better at ordinary stuff, because you start to really know your way around. You know how to do things. And you get to where you feel like, I can really do anything I need to in Photoshop. And you guys can do this. These are just some of the techniques that I know. Some of you guys are already doing this. Some of you may want to learn more. But there's some tips of just trying to keep things clean. Watch for those hard edges. Try to keep layers as non-destructive as possible with masks and things like that. And of course, there's lots of other resources on using some of these individual tools. And if you're new to Photoshop, you're probably going to want to dig into those more. Very powerful stuff. Basically, you have your raw editors, Lightroom, Capture One, things like that. Then you have your pixel level editors, Photoshop, and other options that we're seeing growing competition, which is good. Most of them don't have the tools that Photoshop does, but there is getting to be some other powerful tools. So raw editor, pixel editor, master both of those, and there's some tips for some of the heavy lifting stuff that you might want to do in Photoshop. You guys take care. Hope you found this helpful. We'll see you next time.